I'm outside. I'm at the end of a 4-day camping trip here in beautiful British Columbia, and considering it rained for the first 3 days, I had a lot of time to think. And I started to think about some of my favorite board games based in nature. So before I pack up and hit the road, let's talk about my favorite nature-themed board games in no particular order. Let's start with Photosynthesis. This is such a cool game. There are 2 main phases in this game. In the first phase, players will look at the game board and see where the sun is positioned. They'll then look to see if any of their little 3D trees are in shadow. If they are, they won't earn any action points for those trees. So you're trying to space out your trees to get as much sun as possible, which will mean more action points in phase 2. But the sun rotates each round, which adds another level of complexity. During the second phase, players can upgrade their trees to bigger sizes, they can plant more seeds, they can buy more trees that they can eventually plant, or they can harvest their trees for points. And you get more points if your tree is planted on better soil, with the better soil being located in the middle of the game board. Players start with trees on the outer edge of the game board, so it's a race to get to the middle to the better soil. The point tokens also go in descending order, so there's another race there to get the most valuable points first. This game does hurt my brain a little bit trying to visualize if any of my trees will be in shadow when the sun moves around the board. But from a design standpoint, I think it's just so clever. This idea of having to earn actions in one phase and then use those actions to do things in the second phase is such a great puzzle. Now let's talk about Parks, one of the most beautiful board games ever made. This game features artwork of all of the national parks in the US created by a bunch of different artists that are part of a group called 59 Parks Print Series Group. Not only is this game pretty to look at, it's really fun to play. In this game, you are hikers going along a trail and collecting resource tokens that you can then use to visit different parks, which will give you points. Along your journey, you can also take pictures, which will earn you points, or you can also take canteen cards, where you can spend water to gain other resources. And movement is really interesting in this game because you can only move forward, you can't move back. So maybe there's a resource you really want to go to and don't want to be blocked by other players, so you jump ahead to that space. Now you don't have as many options left because you can only move to the right of your hiker, but each player has 2 hikers, so you can try to time it to get the most out of both of your hikers. This is a clever and beautiful game that will definitely make you want to go visit a national park near you. Moving on to Forbidden Desert. You are completely at the mercy of the elements in this cooperative game by Matt Leacock, the same designer who made Pandemic. In this game, you and your friends are sent on a mission to the desert to collect pieces of a flying ship, just stay with me for a second, that you need to assemble in order to escape a raging sandstorm. Just like in Pandemic, there are several ways you can die in this game. You can die of thirst, you can die from being buried under sand, and you can die if the sandstorm becomes too intense. One of the coolest things about this game that I love is how the wind moves the sand around. So to set up the game, you create a 5x5 grid of tiles, but you leave the middle space open, and this is the eye of the storm. You'll draw a card every turn that will move the eye of the storm around, shifting the tiles and leaving sand in its wake. And of course, the number of cards you turn over, meaning the more sand you'll add to the tiles, will increase as the game goes on. This is one of my favorite cooperative games that really makes you feel like you're in the middle of an unrelenting sandstorm in the desert. Moving on to the Fauna trivia game. This is a fantastic trivia game with some really interesting gameplay, including push your luck and betting aspects. You will learn a lot about animals while genuinely enjoying the gameplay. In this game, a picture of an animal is revealed, and you have to figure out what information about that animal you're most confident about knowing. Maybe its geographic location, or its weight, or the length of its tail. Players take turns placing their guessing cubes either on locations on a world map or on scales. Players can choose how many guesses to make, but if their guess is wrong, they won't get that cube back. So they have to decide how many cubes they're willing to bet and how confident they are. Once all players have placed their guessing cubes, the rest of the animal card is revealed to show all of its locations, its weight, its length, and its tail length. Players then get points for each correctly placed guessing cube as well as any adjacent to the correct answer. Players then take back any cubes that were correct and lose any that were wrong. Players will always have at least 3 guessing cubes, so you want to have as many as possible to work with. Now, unfortunately, this game is pretty tough to find, but it looks like it might be reprinted and it's listed as an upcoming Kickstarter. I'll link to that in the description below. Let's move on now to Karuba. In Karuba, you are adventurers trying to make your way through a jungle to different temples. And what is so cool about this game is that every player takes a copy of the exact same path tile and decides where to place it on their own map. So each player will use the exact same tiles in the exact same order, but it's where they place place their tiles on their map that will be different. So this is like the opposite of a highly asymmetrical game like Root, where each player has different rules and abilities. In Karuba, everyone has the exact same resources and no player has an advantage over the other. So if you win, you really can say you outplayed everyone else at the table, and I find that so fascinating. Moving on to Cascadia. This is a tile drafting game where players try to place habitats and animals in the most beneficial configurations. For example, if you're playing with the grizzly bear mating pair scoring card, you'll want to make sure you have 2 bears next to each other without any bears next to them. And then the Roosevelt elk like to be in straight lines, and then the Chinook salmon like to be in as long of runs as possible. But on top of the animal tokens, you also want to create large connected habitats. The person with the largest of each habitat will gain bonus points. But the most interesting aspect of this game from a design standpoint for me is how tiles are drafted. I know I've talked about this in other videos, like my 5 of the coolest board game mechanics in games I've played recently video, but a couple people commented on that video with some interesting information that I wanted to share with you. So in Cascadia, when you draft habitat tiles and wildlife tokens, you have to take a token and tile in the same column. You can't just take any token and any tile, you have to take a specific pair. And this is really interesting because you have to try to find the best combo or decide if a tile is worth it if it comes along with a token that you might not necessarily want. When I talked about this in my other video, Robert Gustafson commented regarding Verdant and Cascadia. There's a great Board Game Design Lab episode where Fabio Lopiano talks about this and calls it entangled decision making. Forcing players to make multiple decisions at once can really make players' choices more interesting. So Fabio Lopiano designed 3 Ring Circus among other games, and I'll link to his interview on the Board Game Design Lab podcast in the description below. And under Robert's comment, Revi M. Fadley replied, Anthony Faber also calls it entwined drafting. Glad to see it finally grabbing attention, since what surprised me was that Vinci not only introduced it back in the 90s, it also blended entwined drafting with the oldest known example of century-style market where you place currencies on skipped cards. So Anthony Faber is a co-host of the Two Wood for a Wheat podcast, and I found a post he made on BGG about entwined drafting. Here's an excerpt. With entwined drafting, games are accomplishing the goal set out by I Split, You Choose games in creating a hodgepodge of stuff one must take as a whole. The difference here is that no splitter is required. Having a player split things into fair groups is fascinating but can slow the game down, as well as requiring a certain level of mastery on the part of each player in order to work well. Entwined drafting creates the same kind of tough decisions without requiring a player to do the work of splitting. I'll link to this post below if you want to read more. It's really interesting stuff. So I looked at the game Vinci or Vinci that Revi mentioned, and it came out in 1999 and was re-implemented as Small World, which is a game I have played in 2009. And in this game, players can draft tiles, but they come in pairs. So if you take one, you have to take the other, just like in Cascadia. And Revi pointed out that Vinci also has the very interesting mechanic where if you take a pair of tiles down the line, you have to give up points to the pairs that you skip over. You would place a point token on any of the pairs that you skip, and now any player who takes those pairs would take any point tokens that players placed on them when they skipped over them. The game that most people associate with this mechanic is Century Spice Road, which is what Revi is referring to when they say century style market where you place currencies on skipped cards. Thanks so much to Robert and Revi for sharing this info. This community is so awesome and I learned so much from you. Moving on to the award-winning game Wingspan. This is another beautiful game with art featuring a bunch of different birds with facts about each one on the cards. In this game, you are enticing different birds into different habitats, with each bird giving you points and or abilities which you can activate if you use that action for that row. What is really interesting about Wingspan is when you take the action of a row, you can activate all the birds in that row, moving from right to left. And it can be so satisfying to do a bunch of cool powers one right after the other, especially since you start with no birds in any of your habitats. You'll be adding birds and building up your engine, which you can then run to gain more and better things the better your engine is. That is why this game is called an engine building game. There's a reason this is one of the most popular games of all time. You can tell that designer Elizabeth Hargrave genuinely loves birds with just the amount of birds included in this game. There are 170 unique bird cards included, each with a fact about the bird and a power that makes sense for each bird. And it not only looks beautiful, the gameplay is so interesting. Alright, I have to head out, but let me know in the comments any other nature-themed board games that you like. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe if you want to hang out more to talk about board game design. Now, I need to head back to my natural habitat, a warm, dry board game cafe.